Hello and welcome back to the Urban Elementz studio. Today we're going to do something a little unscripted, something without a specific pattern today. We're going to call this Urban Stix, and we're going to be using one of our 2.5-inch strip sets from Island Boutiques. We have these available on the website unless we've run out. So today I think I just need one package of these. And this is basically going to be the general outcome of what we're going to create. This is going to be a smaller quilt. This could be a great project for working with a kid, a summer project. And basically it's going to be made up of 3 strip sets that we're going to sew using our 2.5-inch strips. And then we're going to have an alternate fabric which I have upstairs, so we'll see that in a second. So I'm going to go ahead and open up one of my packs, and we're going to go ahead and show you what we're going to do in the first step. What I'm going to do here is open up one of our strip sets and pull that out. These boutiques are from Island Boutique, and we until we run out, we have these available on our website. And I believe the package, it was, let's see, I believe it was $42.95, but they're on sale while supplies last for $30. And I'm going to open one of these up, and we're going to select out, for this particular project, 4 of the colors that we want to use from this. And you'll notice that each package has 2 strips of each color. So we're going to either use, and this is totally up to you, we're going to either use 2 of the same strips for a repeating pattern, or if you want a larger variety, you could use additional sets from that, but you'll see how this goes together, and then you can make up your mind. So it's just a matter of selecting out 4 colors for me, and I think I'm going to select out green and purple because the alternate fabric I'm going to use is a green and purple. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that fabric just to show you what my thought process is. There's literally so many different ways that I could go with this. This is the background fabric that I want to use for where the blue is on this pattern. And these alternating stripes originally were designed from using a repeating set of 2 strata units. Each strata unit had 4 strips in it. So you would need only a total of 8 strips to do this particular quilt. It is a rather smaller quilt. The finished size is somewhere around 38 by 56 or something like that. We'll see when we get to that. But I could do 2 identical strip sets. I could do 3 completely different strip sets so that each one is different. Or I could use strips from both sets in coordinating colors. So 2 green, 2 purple, 2 lime green, and 2 of the other purple. 2 sets of each, and just do the complete quilt out of that color combination, which wouldn't let me use as many colors. So I'm going to iron my background fabric and get that ready, and I'm going to open up the strips that I'm going to use and just press out that crease where they've been folded in the package for so long. I want to make sure that these are perfectly ironed out so we don't have that crease represented in our final piece. And then I'm going to start sewing my strip sets together in sets of 2. So I have to make a quick decision which way I'm going to go with my background fabric and with my strips. I almost feel like I want a 3rd strip set just to have 1 strip set from each, and if I have some leftover strata units, that's fine. So I'm going to go ahead and get these sewn, and we'll show you what that looks like. Before I could even get to ironing my background, I played with my strips a little bit more, and I think I'm going with this color combination. I'm going to do each row of my urban Stix out of one strip strata unit. So we'll have the three colors represented in these three sets, and I will have a few leftover units out of each one when I'm finished, but that's okay. I could use them on the back, or I could use them in another project. But this is how I'm going to go. So I'm going to get my fabric ironed in the background and set up the sewing machine. Well, it's really nice to be sitting here in the sunshine, I can tell you that. I've got my strips ironed. Basically, these strips are right out of the package. All I've done is open them up and iron them on the crease line. I did not wash these. Generally, I do wash all of my fabric unless it's a pre-cut strip or square like this. If you tried to wash these, even by hand, they would fray on the edges. Batiks are washed so much in the process of creating the fabric that I'm less worried about batiks than I am with traditionally printed fabrics, which are never washed in the printing process. They just get printed and heat set. So these are right out of the package. As you can see, I've layered these in 2 strips per set, and this is the way I'm going to sew them together. Generally, what I would tell kids when I was sewing, if I was using printed fabric, is that the printed fabric needs to face each other when you're sewing it together. Just like you are facing your friend when you're talking to each other, you're communicating. That's the same way we piece our fabric together. But with batiks, there is no wrong or right side, so I don't have to worry about which way these get layered. I will make sure that my edges are really nice and lined up. I am not going to pin these because I'm going to sew pretty slowly and make sure that I'm getting a good 1/4 inch seam allowance. I do have on my 1/4 inch foot on my sewing machine, and I also have on my straight stitch plate, which just has a single hole which will only accommodate a straight stitch. And I just like sewing that with that plate on because it gives me less problems at the beginning and end of a seam. So I'm going to sew these together with a strip that's perfectly matched. You can look on both sides of the strip and see if it's out of alignment. I'm going to go ahead and zoom the camera in, and hopefully you'll be able to see here on this side how it's getting off a little bit, and I'll go ahead and correct that as I'm sewing. As you can see here on this edge, I'm getting a little bit of the underneath strip showing, so I'm just going to lightly lift up my bottom fabric, my top fabric, and shift that over. With these exactly the same size strip, it's easy to see if that's peeking out on one side or the other, that the strip needs to be adjusted slightly. So I'm just going to keep an eye on that as I sew all of my strip sets together in these combinations. This is a really great practice project for young or inexperienced quilters because the finished strip sets are not going to line up to any other blocks or any other seams. So if our seam allowance is off a little bit, or our cutting is off a little bit in the construction of this quilt, it's not going to be readily apparent just from viewing it. And this gives somebody practice in sewing together these long strip sets. Now you could certainly, if you wanted, pin these strips together beforehand. You could use the little clips, or you could even use a little glue stick right along the seam allowance before you layer the 2 pieces. That way they would stay in position as you were sewing. But I'm going to go ahead and finish off the rest of these strips and show you the ironing process. In just a few minutes of sewing, I have all of my strip sets sewn, and I always like to give a press on top of the seam. I've always heard that that helps compress the stitching. Not that it really would make a huge difference in this particular project. As I said, this is a really great beginner project. I just lift up the top layer, and I'm going to use the iron to push open that seam so that we don't have any little tiny micro accordion pleats in there. And I'm going to do that all the way across, and I'm going to do it for each of my units. And then after I do both units, I'm going to marry these back up with their partner, because each strata unit is going to be a combination of 4 strips, and then we're going to subcut that to sew the rows. I love batiks because they iron so crisp and clean. Not to mention the beautiful saturation of color. Now this is where you have an option of seeing which way you want these to go together. But remember that this is going to be repeated over and over, so even when I cut and sew these back together, these are going to be joined again. So it really doesn't matter which way, but you could flip these if you wanted to, but I'm going to keep mine the way I had it. That way all of my even edges can start together when I start sewing. Actually, it's not going to matter. So I'm going to go ahead and match these up and get them over to the ironing machine, and we'll sew together these strip sets. As you can see, I have my 2 strip sets, one laid on top of each other. These are both where I started, so we have nice even tops there. That's not going to make a huge difference because we are going to trim these off before we start, just to make sure we get crisp sections when we're ready to sew. But again, just as I said earlier with the printed fabric, when we're sewing units together, we want to make sure that they're facing each other, just like 2 friends talking. They have to be facing each other to communicate. So we have those set together. Again, you could pin this unit together, use clips, use a glue stick right along your seam allowance if you wanted to. I'm going to sew slowly. I'm using the edge of my 1/4" foot as a guide. I'm also using the little indentation on my stitch plate as a guide. And if you need more help than that, you could put a piece of masking tape or even layers of built-up masking tape in a line on your machine table. I could use it on the bottom of my plexiglass here if I wanted, just to give me an additional guideline. And if you were setting up something like that, you'd want to use a ruler to make sure you had it straight to begin with. Again, with this unit, you can keep an eye on both sides to make sure that you are keeping a fairly decent coverage of your top and bottom pieces. Sometimes I will take my finger and I will put it on a section of the quilt or fabric strip that I've lifted up and made sure that it's perfectly overlapped, and I will just hold my finger on that spot as I move up towards the stitching, and then I'll make sure it's adjusted again and do that same process over and over again to make sure that I'm keeping a fairly good overlap on my fabric. you really want to make sure that your fabric is lined up further back than just at the needle, so that you don't have to make a huge jolt or correction in your stitching. But again, I will say this is a very forgiving pattern, because none of the seams are going to line up with any other seams in the process. So if your seam allowance was not perfect, or your cutting is not perfect on this project, it's not going to be so apparent from a visual standpoint. So we're going to continue that with the other two strip sets, and then we'll press those open and we'll move to the cutting table to cut those into strata units. We have each of our 3 strip sets, or 3 stratas, completely sewn together. Each one has 4 2.5-inch strips, just as they came out of the package. So now we're going to go ahead and subcut these. The first thing I'm going to do is just clean up this first edge on the first set, and I'm going to use a rotary cutter. If you were working with kids on this project, the rotary cutter is not something that I would let them use at this point. They do make safety rotary cutters that are basically a tray with a slide and a hand-covered rotary cutter that you would use, but I haven't seen one of those in a while. What I'm going to do is cut each of these sections in a 3.5-inch strip. And I'm not happy with that first cut, so I'm going to flip it over. One of the things I've always heard is that your best cuts are when the fabric that you need is under the ruler. So I'm going to use one of the lines, I want to make sure we're getting that, one of the lines on my ruler right on the seam line of one of my sets, and move that over to the edge, and then I'm going to go ahead and cut away that piece. I don't mind flipping this back and forth, and I may straighten up that edge a couple times as I cut across. But this time I'm going to cut 3.5-inch sets, and I need 7 of these from this unit. So I have my 3.5-inch mark. Actually, if I flip it this way, this side has a 1/2 inch added. So I can just look for my 3-inch mark on there. I'm going to line up the edge with the clean cut edge that I just created. I'm also going to line up the line of the ruler with one of my seam lines. And I'm going to go ahead and repeat that process for a total of 7 times. And if I need to, I can clean up the edge as many times as I need to, because I have enough fabric to do that. And I'm going to go ahead and repeat that until I have all of my strip pieces cut for the entire top out of these units. Now I really only needed a total of 8 strips to do this quilt, but because I wanted the color variety, I added additional strips, which means I will have additional units left over. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so I need 2 more. You'll find that I like to count over and over when I'm doing something, because it helps me prevent making a mistake, especially when I'm concentrating on filming or talking or doing something else. And you can see I have plenty of this left over. Let's see what we actually have. 20 inches. You could almost get 2 quilts out of this. So I'll go ahead and finish this for the other 2 strip sets, and then we'll go back down and do some sewing of these together. And the way these are going to go together now is like this. So we'll go ahead and finish the cutting up, and then we'll start again. I have 7 units from each of my colorways, and what I'm going to do now is pair these up in couples and sew them together. Again, I want to make sure that my right sides are together. We want our friends facing each other so that they can communicate. And I'm just going to, you could pin these if you felt like you wanted to or needed to. I'm just going to line up this edge here, and I'm going to sew these together in sets of 2, but I'm not going to stop after each one. I'm just going to grab my next set, and we're going to chain piece these, which is just another technique. We have our strip sewing so far, strip piecing, subcutting, and now we're doing some chain piecing. We're going to chain these together, which just speeds up the process a little bit and saves a little bit of thread at the beginning and end of each row. And because we have an odd number, I'll have one that I'll have to save until the end. And once I get these done, I'll just move on to another colorway. And in so doing, we will have these sewn together fairly quickly. Right sides together, our friends are communicating. But you can see we really don't have any seams that are lining up anywhere so far, and so if we were fractionally off either with the size of the strips to begin with our pressing, with our seam allowances, it wouldn't have created an issue. And again, we have one left over. So I'll finish the blue, and then we'll just iron these out, sew those together, and we can add on the oddball to each colorway. And before you know it, we'll have each of our 3 strip sets done for this project. Then it's just a matter of cutting our background and piecing those rows together. Now that I have my units separated and ironed out, I can go ahead and add 2 of these units together. And again, we want the friends facing each other. And I don't have to worry about these seams lining up because they won't be connected to anything when we're finished. And did you see what I just did? Totally messed that up. I'm sewing down the long edge, which is totally not where I'm supposed to be sewing. So I'm just going to do a little frog stitching, which I have to do with my seam ripper. And that is rip it, rip it, rip it. So I'll put that back together and sew it on the right seam this time. I'm glad somebody stopped me before I got too far. Okay, this looks better. Now we can go ahead and pull out that odd unit and sew it together with this one. And then we just have to join, after we press this open, we can just join these 2 pieces together. And we should have our finished length. ends facing each other. I'm really surprised how much I'm liking this blue set. I was initially trying to go with mostly purple and green, which is my favorite color combination. But that's just how life is. Sometimes fabric will surprise you. My favorite color is green, and it's very hard to find green in menswear. The most popular color in menswear in the clothing department is blue. Okay, let's get these ironed open. Okay, after I had those strip sets ironed, then I'm just going to go ahead and join these last two units of each style together, and you'll be able to figure out very easily what size you would like this to be yourself. If you wanted to make this a little bit longer, especially in the way that I did it here, you could just join, subcut up some more of the strips that we had left uncut and make this longer. Or you could add additional colorways or additional strata to create the length that you want. So I have my 3 units cut apart, and we'll get these opened up and show you what that looks like. These are our 3 strips. We have the one last seam to iron, and then you can begin to see what this will look like when it's finished. I dropped something. So basically, this is the approximation of what this will look like when it's all finished. Now, you could easily have used just one colorway for the entire project. You could do as I did and have 3 different strips. I mean, the color combinations are really endless on this. You could use your background fabric as your beginning point and pull colors from that. But I love these 2.5 inch strips that are pre-packaged because it makes the project so simple. This has only been maybe an hour's worth of sewing and cutting, and all I have left to do is cut this background. Now what I'm going to do is cut each of these strips in 7.5 inch widths by the length of my strata unit, so that I can sew them together and then piece the quilt together. So I won't need all of the width of the background fabric. I just need 4 times 7 is 29, 31 inches approximately. So I'll go ahead and take this upstairs and show you what the cutting of the background looks like, and then we can have the few final seams to put it all together. I have my fabric folded over on itself just the way that it would have come off of the bolt. My fabric has been washed, dried, and pressed. And I just laid my strip units on here so I can get an approximation of how long this needs to be. Now, depending on how many units you made, you may get a different measurement. But I'm right here between 57 and 58 inches. But I'm going to probably cut my piece at 59 inches just so that when I put all my units together, I have some extra to trim off, and I would rather trim off and waste the background than I would my pieced units. So I'm going to go ahead and make that cut. This is off of my strip sets. They're protected by 1.5 inches, 2 inches. So I can go ahead and remove those. Again, I was just using them as a reference. And now I'm going to change the way that this fabric is folded. I'm going to open it up and fold it on top of itself on the length instead of the width. I'm going to try and line up the selvage edge on top of itself as closely as possible. That's about 29 inches, which is still a little too wide or long for my ruler to go over, so I'm going to fold it one more time. So that I could lay the ruler on it one time and get my cuts. I'm going to take a minute and rub that to make sure that I don't feel any pleats. And I'm going to line up the fold on one of the lines of my mat. And I will reposition the camera so we're looking right down here at the beginning. I'm going to come around to the opposite side here just so I can give myself a clean cut. Again, I find I get the best cuts if the fabric that I want to use is underneath the ruler because it's completely held in place. Now I'm switching back. What I need are 7.5 inch strips, and I need 4 of them. So I have my 1/2 inch on the ruler here for this side, so I just have to go to my 7 mark. I can cross-reference the lines of the ruler with the mat. I can do it with the fold of the fabric. And I just make clean cuts. Now again, if I made an error in any one of these strips, let's say I cut one of them 7 inches instead of 7.5, not going to make a difference. It's not going to line up to any other pieces. In fact, I could intentionally cut all 4 of these 4 different sizes. Wouldn't make any difference. There's almost no mistake that you could make on the cutting or ironing of this that would make an incredible difference in this quilt. So I have my 4 units and my 3 strata units that will go in between each one of these, and I'm just going to go down and seam those together, and we'll show you what the finished top looks like. Okay, I've got my 4 background strip sets. I'm just going to choose one of those and open it up, and I'm going to choose one of my strip sets, and I'm going to line up the 2 long edges. We have the friends facing each other so they can communicate. I'm going to roughly line up the top. I want to try and get that as close as possible so I don't have to do a lot of trimming on the top, and I'll leave all my trimming to the bottom. But I just decided I'm going to flip this around. The reason I flipped it around was so that all of my, well, the majority of my seam ironing are going that way. I may not find that's the case on all of them, but it seemed like the majority. So, but ironing is not a huge deal on this. Again, the seams don't have to line up with anything, so if they're ironed in different directions, it really doesn't matter. Again, I'm going to keep the top and bottom edges lined up. If I have an opposing iron seam, I'm just going to use my finger to hold it down in place as it goes underneath the pressing foot. Again, I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance, but if your seam allowance was off on this, it isn't going to make a huge difference visually because you just won't be able to tell. And I'm going to continue this process on this strip, and I'm going to repeat the process with the other 2 strips and get those pressed open. I have my 3 strip sets sewn to 3 pieces of the background, and now I need to press this, and it might seem like it would make sense to press it here and then flip it over, but I'm actually going to do the opposite. What I want to do is press it from the back, and then I'll flip this piece over, because this piece doesn't have any seam lines in it. In order to press it back, I'll get a much flatter seam line on there, a much flatter crease, without having all that bulk of of those strata units flipping back on itself. So it may seem a little counterintuitive, but we're going to do the same thing and just lift that out and press the iron up against the edge of the seam so that we don't get any accordion pleats in there. Again, not that it would make any difference in this project, because this is a very forgiving pattern. So I'm going to go ahead and get the other 2 strip units and backgrounds sewn together, and we'll go ahead and press 2 of those together and 1 of the extra background pieces. Now I'm at the point where I'm going to sew together 2 of my background and strip sets together. I am paying attention how I want the final colorway to go before I start sewing. And I'm going to go ahead and put this under the foot and just start sewing. And I'm going to occasionally just lift up the edge to make sure that I'm right on the seam on each. Now, of course, I could pin this. If I were worried, I could use little clips as I was sewing. But I'm not incredibly worried because this is such a fun and carefree project. As long as I catch the seams on both of those sides, I'm going to be happy. I've got my 2 large components now. I'm just going to flip those over now that I know I have them in the orientation that I wanted them. I wanted that hotter color in the middle and the cooler colors on the outside edge. And now I'm just going to seam this down, and that will be a wrap for this one. I'll get it ironed and show you what that looks like in just a second. 2 shakes of a lamb's tail, since Easter's coming. Well, we started with a package of the 2.5 inch strips. They're Island Batik. As long as we have these available on our website, they're going to be $30. And we had an idea. Our idea was to make this easy quilt top. I'm going to call it Urban Stix. And it's fairly easy. This is one that you could do with kids or beginners if you wanted, because none of the seams have to line up with anything else, and the ironing and the pressing, if these were not exact, it's not going to make a difference visually. But we have the finished top here. Any color combination really would work with this quilt. I didn't really think I'm going to have to trim the top, I will have to trim the bottom because I did leave excess background fabric so I could trim it without wasting any of my strip sets that I had sewn together. We just used the 2.5-inch strips as they came out of the package. We sewed 2 strips together, opened those up, and added 2 more for each strip set. They were subcut in 3.5-inch strips, and then they were sewn together end to end. Our background piece were cut 7.5 inches wide, and those were sewn together with each of the strip sets. Then we joined those together and added on our last side. So this is a fairly simple project, and I really just love it. It's great as a beginner's project, and it's great for kids. It would be great for a charity quilt because it goes together so fast, and the units are chain pieced, and you could have a variety of people working on these at the same time. So I want to thank you for joining us today, and we'll look forward to seeing you again next time.